I thought the 2,000-degree kiln fire melting my flesh was the worst pain imaginable. I was wrong. The true nightmare began when I woke up in sterile bandages, realizing my husband was busy selling my life's work on a Miami golf course. He assumed I would die quietly in that hospital bed. He had no idea the flames did not destroy me. They merely forged the blade that would end his empire. Hello to the wonderful audience of Violet Revenge stories. Unfortunately, our channel has been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without a budget to operate. So if you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the comment section of this video. My name is Ella Crawford. The sterile white ceiling of the Seattle Burn Center was my entire universe for what felt like an absolute eternity. My reality had been completely reduced to the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of the ventilator and the unbearable scent of medical antiseptic that failed to mask the lingering phantom smell of charred skin. The kiln explosion at Apex Glassworks was a catastrophic event that shattered my life in an instant. It tore through the main production floor with a deafening roar, sending a massive wave of 2,000-degree heat that completely swallowed my right shoulder and the entire expanse of my upper back. I was suddenly trapped in a terrifying prison of agonizing raw nerves and tightly bound medical gauze. Every single breath I took felt exactly like inhaling finely shattered glass, serving as a cruel, unrelenting reminder of the safety I once felt within the walls of my own factory. But the extreme physical agony, the excruciating surgical process of dead tissue removal, and the relentless burning sensation were only a small fraction of the immense torment I was forced to endure. The true chilling horror was sitting right beside my hospital bed day after day. My husband, Vance, occupied the small plastic visitor chair, not like a deeply worried spouse terrified of losing his wife, but rather like a delayed passenger stuck in a severely underfunded airport lounge, while I lay there fighting desperately for my life, shivering uncontrollably through feverish chills and clenching my jaw against the overwhelming pain. Vance was visibly annoyed by my presence. He did not gently hold my good hand. He did not lean in to whisper words of comfort or promise me that we would get through this tragedy together. Instead, he complained endlessly about the watery, tasteless hospital coffee, letting out loud, dramatic sighs every single time a nurse entered the room to check my vital signs. His thumbs flew across his shiny smartphone screen with a frantic, relentless energy. The sharp, rapid taps of his constant typing echoed in the quiet, somber room, creating a cruel soundtrack to his profound indifference. Whenever I involuntarily moaned in pain, he would look up with a tight, deeply impatient expression, looking at me as if my severe physical suffering was merely a personal inconvenience interfering with his daily schedule. It took exactly 14 agonizing days for my dedicated medical team to finally declare that I had safely passed the critical, life-threatening window for severe infection. It was a massive medical milestone that absolutely should have brought tears of overwhelming relief to his eyes. Instead, it acted as the immediate green light he had evidently been waiting for all along. On the very afternoon the head doctor gave us the good news, Vance stood up, casually adjusted his perfectly pressed designer shirt, and coldly announced that he was leaving. He stated that he had to fly down to Miami immediately to attend a mandatory company golf retreat. He actually stood tall right over my hospital bed, looking down at my heavily bandaged, broken body, and told me that the emotional stress of dealing with my accident had taken a massive toll on his mental health. He claimed he desperately needed a few days out on the green golf course just to decompress and relieve his stress. I felt a cold, terrifying panic rise deep in my chest, painfully tightening my bruised throat. I begged him to stay. I pleaded with a raspy, incredibly weak voice, telling him I was deeply terrified, that I could barely move an inch without wanting to scream, and that I just needed my husband by my side for a little bit longer. Ella, please. Vance sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if I were a spoiled child throwing a ridiculous tantrum over a broken toy. "You are out of the woods now. The nurses are here taking care of you round the clock. Do not overreact and make this all about you. I need to breathe, okay? I will be back before you even realize I'm gone." With those heartless words, he turned on his heel. I watched in completely stunned silence as he reached over and grabbed his custom-made, $5,000 set of professional golf clubs from the corner of the small room. It was a massive golf bag he had practically moved into my tiny recovery space days ago, just to ensure the clubs were safe from theft. He slung them over his shoulder and walked straight out the door. He did not look back, not even once. The heavy wooden hospital door clicked shut, completely sealing me inside a quiet, sterile tomb of utter betrayal. Several hours passed in agonizing silence. The long evening shadows began to stretch slowly across the cold linoleum floor, as the heavy, comforting dose of my intravenous painkillers began to gradually wear off. The searing, biting agony deeply embedded in my ruined back returned with a terrifying vengeance. But as the physical pain spiked, another kind of sharp ache began to gnaw at my racing mind. A creeping, deeply unsettling instinct washed over me. I desperately needed to check on the daily operations of Apex Glassworks. I needed the familiar, comforting routine of my life's work to mentally ground me in this nightmare. Slowly, fighting intensely through massive waves of blinding pain and sudden nausea, I managed to reach my one unaffected arm toward my personal overnight bag resting quietly on the metal bedside table. My trembling fingers fumbled clumsily through the fabric zippers, blindly searching for the familiar cold metal casing of my highly secure company laptop, the essential device that held the absolute lifeblood of my entire manufacturing business. The compartment was completely empty. The laptop was gone. My heart instantly hammered violently against my ribs, sending fresh, unbearable shockwaves of pure pain radiating through my extensively burnt shoulder. I frantically reached out and pressed the glowing red call button. When the assigned night nurse finally arrived, a very kind, soft-spoken woman whose plastic name badge I could barely focus my eyes on, I desperately begged her to let me borrow her personal tablet device. She hesitated for a moment, clearly concerned by my highly frantic, panicked state, but eventually, she handed the screen over to me. My hands shook violently, almost dropping the device, as I rapidly pulled up the remote server login portal for Apex Glassworks. I carefully typed in my top-tier master credentials, the exact security codes I had personally built from the ground up, the ultimate keys that granted me total, unrestricted control over my life's work. The tablet screen suddenly flashed a stark, glaring red message. Access denied. Administrator privileges revoked. I lay there completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the glowing screen while the harsh artificial light reflected off the warm tears finally spilling down my scarred cheeks. Vance had not simply gone off to Miami to play a relaxing game of golf. He had stolen my entire company, and he had purposely left me trapped right here, physically crippled and seemingly defenseless, fully believing I was way too weak to ever fight back. The paralyzing wave of sorrow did not last long. Staring at that glaring red error message on the borrowed tablet, the initial shock quickly dissolved into a freezing, calculated focus. Panic was a luxury I could no longer afford. My hands were still shaking slightly, but my mind was sharpening into a deadly weapon. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, yet I knew precisely who would be awake and pacing the factory floor at this hour. I navigated to the dial pad and called the direct cell number of Clara, my fiercely loyal production floor manager who treated the manufacturing plant like her own home. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tight with exhaustion and immediate concern for my well-being. "I need you to go up to the executive suite," I whispered into the microphone, forcing my voice to remain completely steady despite the agonizing, pulsating pain radiating across my back. "Do not let the security guards or anyone else see you. Tell me exactly what it looks like up there." I listened to the faint, rhythmic thumping of her heavy steel-toed boots, carefully climbing the metal spiral staircase. A tense, heavy silence stretched over the cellular connection for nearly 2 full minutes before she finally spoke. her breath hitching in pure disbelief. "The locks are completely different," Clara murmured, her voice echoing slightly in the dark, empty executive hallway. He replaced the heavy brass deadbolts on your office doors, and looking through the frosted glass partitions, "Your filing cabinets are wide open and completely bare. Every single blueprint tube, every physical accounting ledger is gone." Yesterday afternoon, he sent out a company-wide memo claiming he was simply securing our highly valuable physical assets while you were recovering. We all assumed he was just stepping up to be protective. "Thank you, Clara," I replied coldly, my jaw clenching. "Go back down to the floor, act completely normal, and do not say a single word about this to anyone." I ended the call, staring intensely at the glowing digital screen. He honestly thought he had completely locked me out by revoking my standard network administrator privileges, but he fundamentally misunderstood the architect he was dealing with. I built the entire digital infrastructure of that factory from the absolute ground up, back when we were operating out of a damp, freezing garage over 7 years ago, long before his deceitful presence ever entered my life. I had hard-coded a hidden digital backdoor deep within the core server architecture, a silent ghost protocol known exclusively to me. It took me nearly 45 minutes of agonizing, one-handed typing, fighting through massive waves of blinding physical pain and severe nausea, to carefully bypass the primary firewalls and slip entirely unnoticed right past his incredibly clumsy security measures. Once inside the internal email servers, I bypassed my own deactivated inbox and dove straight into his private, heavily encrypted communication folders. What I unearthed there was more than enough to make the blood freeze solid in my veins. There were dozens of meticulously hidden email threads stretching back over 8 full months, long before the tragic incident at the factory ever occurred. He was engaged in deep, highly structured negotiations with a massive foreign manufacturing conglomerate, our absolute biggest global rival. Attached to these daily messages were high-resolution digital scans of my proprietary tempered glass formulas, the exact chemical compositions that gave my business its massive, multi-million-dollar market advantage. He was not looking for a silent partner or a minor investor. He was actively arranging an absolute outright sale of my entire intellectual property portfolio. I swiftly pulled up the corporate credit card expense logs, my eyes scanning the live geolocation pings from the past 24 hours. The mandatory company retreat was nothing but an elaborate, sickeningly expensive smokescreen. The transaction history showed him charging tens of thousands of dollars at an ultra-exclusive, 5-star beach resort on the coast. He was not swinging clubs on the green to relieve his emotional stress. He was currently hosting private, top-tier executive dinners, buying absurdly expensive vintage champagne and premium imported cigars to grease the wheels and finalize the complete transfer of my life's work to our sworn competitors. But the most damning, terrifying piece of evidence was buried inside a hidden subfolder labeled simply as legal transfers. I clicked on a heavily compressed file and watched with a stopping heart as a formal medical power of attorney loaded onto the screen. It was a perfectly notarized legal document, explicitly claiming that due to my catastrophic physical injuries and heavily medicated state, I was entirely incapacitated and of completely unsound mind. At the bottom of the very last page was a flawlessly forged replica of my handwritten signature. He had expertly used the exact timeline of my medically induced coma to legally crown himself the sole, uncontested decision-maker. He had granted himself the ultimate legal authority to liquidate absolutely everything I owned. The tablet screen blurred as a profound, horrifying realization suddenly washed over my entire being: the violent factory explosion. I had personally inspected the massive thermal regulators just 48 hours before the blast tore through the facility. They were in perfect, fully functional condition. The emergency safety valves had been manually disabled. The critical pressure gauges intentionally rigged to fail under maximum heat. The catastrophic failure that melted my skin and nearly ended my existence was never a random industrial accident. It was a cold, highly calculated assassination attempt cleverly disguised as a tragic workplace disaster. This entire marriage, every fake smile, every shared anniversary dinner, had been nothing more than a patient, utterly ruthless asset-stripping plot. He wanted the lucrative company. He wanted the exclusive patents, and he desperately needed me dead or permanently disabled to snatch them away. The tears that had been welling in my eyes instantly evaporated, leaving my vision crystal clear. The overwhelming, crushing grief of a broken heart was entirely replaced by something far more potent and dangerous. Pure, unadulterated, highly calculated rage. The agonizing pain radiating from my thickly bandaged back no longer felt like a horrific injury to be endured. It felt like pure, volatile fuel. He truly believed he had left a helpless, defeated victim behind to rot quietly in Seattle. He was about to find out that trying to burn me alive was the absolute worst, most fatal mistake he could have ever made. Every single morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the surgical team arrived for the daily debridement and bandage change. It was a brutally necessary procedure where charred tissue was mercilessly scraped away to prevent life-threatening infections. The physical agony was so profoundly intense it completely blinded my vision and left me desperately gasping for air, violently clutching the cold metal side rails of the hospital bed until my knuckles turned absolutely white. I tasted copper as I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming out loud. But I steadfastly refused to ask the nurses for any additional heavy sedatives. I desperately needed my mind to remain a razor-sharp instrument. The moment the medical staff finally wheeled their metal carts out of the sterile room, I propped my borrowed tablet against a plastic water pitcher and immediately initiated a highly secure, encrypted video connection. I reached out to Elias Thorne. Elias was a ruthless, notoriously aggressive intellectual property attorney who had built a truly terrifying reputation for completely destroying corporate thieves in the federal courtroom. He was definitely not cheap, and he was absolutely not gentle, which made him the exact legal weapon I required. When his sharp, unyielding face appeared on the high-resolution screen, I did not waste a single valuable second on polite pleasantries. I rapidly laid out every single piece of stolen digital data, the expertly forged medical proxy document, and the live, ticking timeline of the Miami corporate negotiations. Elias listened with extreme intensity, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits as he rapidly reviewed the complex files I had forwarded to his secure server. His legal assessment was incredibly grim and terrifyingly blunt. He firmly warned me that if my husband managed to put pen to paper and sign that final corporate transfer agreement at the luxury Miami resort, the massive foreign conglomerate would instantly hold ironclad, entirely legal possession of every single proprietary patent I had ever created in my life. The international legal warfare required to reverse such a massive transaction could easily take over 5 grueling, exhausting years and cost tens of millions of dollars in legal fees, effectively plunging me into absolute, irreversible financial ruin. We had an impossibly microscopic window of opportunity to strike back and halt the transaction. I needed to buy Elias enough precious time to build a rock-solid federal case and secure an emergency legal injunction from a judge to immediately freeze the forged power of attorney. To accomplish that monumental task, I had to completely derail that Miami deal from closing today. I immediately called Clara back on her encrypted cell line. The expansive factory floor was now heavily monitored by the invasive new security cameras my husband had recently installed, so she was forced to take my urgent call huddled deep inside a loud, constantly vibrating mechanical utility closet. I rapidly explained the entire horrific reality of our current situation. The blatant corporate espionage, the heavily forged legal documents, and the imminent, massive threat to everyone's livelihood if the factory was sold off to foreign asset strippers. Clara did not panic or hesitate for a fraction of a second. Instead, a fiercely protective anger ignited instantly in her voice. I instructed her to quietly and carefully assemble a very small, tightly knit group of our most veteran floor workers, the dedicated men and women who had stood by my side since day one and whose deep loyalty simply could not be bought with any amount of money. My husband had foolishly scheduled a high-stakes, live broadcast product demonstration for precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon. He arrogantly intended to stream the brutal physical stress test of our newest, most incredibly durable architectural glass directly to the luxurious executive boardroom in Miami to clearly prove the absolute, unmatched superiority of the chemical formula he was trying to steal. We were going to give them a truly spectacular, unforgettable show. Under my precise, highly technical instructions delivered through the phone, Clara and the veteran crew moved like invisible phantoms through the busy production line. They seamlessly bypassed the digital security monitors and manually altered the core thermal calibration metrics on the exact industrial tempering machines designated for the demonstration batch. They subtly dropped the crucial cooling cycle duration by precisely 14% and intentionally spiked the internal pneumatic pressure parameters just enough to fundamentally compromise the hidden structural integrity of the glass without ever triggering the loud automatic safety alarms. When 2 o'clock finally arrived, I anxiously watched the live private broadcast through my secret backdoor server access. On the bright screen, the lead floor engineer, completely unaware of the intentional sabotage, confidently placed the massive, seemingly flawless pane of our premium glass into the giant hydraulic testing press. Down in Miami, my husband and the wealthy foreign executives were undoubtedly watching on a massive high-definition television screen, eagerly waiting for the glass to easily withstand tens of thousands of pounds of sheer pressure. The massive hydraulic press slowly engaged. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the thick glass held its ground. Then, with a deafening, incredibly violent crack that echoed terribly through the live microphone feed, the entire pane exploded into millions of useless, glittering shards of absolute failure. The foreign executives were surely recoiling in complete shock. The pristine, supposedly indestructible industrial product they were about to spend hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring had just failed spectacularly on a live camera feed. The entire multi-million-dollar acquisition process immediately ground to a chaotic, deeply embarrassing halt. Less than 10 minutes later, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the thin plastic hospital mattress cover. It was him. I let the phone ring exactly 4 times, taking a deep, calculated breath to forcefully steady my racing pulse before finally sliding my finger across the glass screen. I answered the call with a weak, incredibly frail whisper, perfectly playing the pathetic role of the heavily medicated, exhausted, and clueless wife. He did not even bother asking a single question about how I was feeling or if my pain had subsided. He was practically screaming directly into the receiver, cursing loudly at the top of his lungs about the absolute, unbelievable incompetence of the factory workers. He raged wildly about how the idiotic engineering team had just humiliated him profoundly in front of the absolute most important financial investors on the entire planet. He was clearly pacing furiously around his luxurious hotel suite, throwing a massive, pathetic tantrum, loudly complaining that he was constantly surrounded by useless fools who were actively trying to ruin his perfect life. I listened quietly to his pathetic, childish meltdown, actively suppressing a cold, highly triumphant smile that tugged at the corners of my lips. I whispered softly into the phone, "You are so brilliant, honey. Do not let them upset you. You can easily fix whatever the stupid staff broke. Just stay perfectly calm and take another 24 hours to smooth things over with the buyers. Go have a nice dinner and handle it tomorrow." I stroked his incredibly fragile, massive ego with every single carefully chosen word, expertly and flawlessly manipulating his massive arrogance. My sweet, thoroughly submissive words completely disarmed his immediate panic. He let out a long, incredibly arrogant sigh. "You are absolutely right, Ella. They are complete idiots. I will personally fix this ridiculous mess tomorrow morning," he stated proudly. He hung up the phone, completely and utterly oblivious to the terrifying fact that the weak, physically shattered woman heavily wrapped in sterile gauze thousands of miles away was the exact, calculated architect of his sudden, devastating downfall. He truly thought he was granting himself a simple 24-hour extension to save his lucrative deal. In reality, He had just handed Elias Thorne the exact number of crucial hours needed to march straight into the federal courthouse and drop a heavy, inescapable legal guillotine right on his miserable neck. The wait inside the hospital room was absolutely suffocating. The heavy, sterile air felt so thick it was hard to pull into my lungs. Every single minute that ticked by on the digital wall clock felt like an eternity of agonizing suspense. Finally, exactly at 8:30 in the evening, my encrypted phone vibrated against the plastic tray table. It was Elias Thorne. His voice was completely steady, vibrating with the quiet thrill of a perfectly executed legal strike. He told me the federal judge had signed the emergency injunction just an hour prior, and the timing of the delivery was nothing short of cinematic perfection. Vance had been sitting at a candlelit table inside a highly exclusive, five-star waterfront restaurant in Miami. He was busy hosting the final celebratory dinner with the wealthy foreign executives. According to the process server Elias had hired, Vance had just ordered a $5,000 bottle of vintage champagne to toast the imminent signing of the transfer documents. Just as he proudly raised his crystal glass, the process server, flanked by two local county deputies, walked right past the maitre d' and dropped a massive, heavily stamped stack of federal court documents right next to his expensive steak. The lead foreign executive took one single look at the bold United States federal court seal and the glaring headline explicitly citing fraudulent transfer and stolen intellectual property. The entire foreign delegation practically sprinted for the nearest exit. They were ruthless corporate sharks. But they were certainly not stupid enough to willingly entangle themselves in a massive federal criminal investigation. They vanished into the Miami night, completely abandoning the deal. But Elias revealed a second, far more terrifying layer to the situation. Vance had not just been trying to sell the company, to finance his lavish, secretive lifestyle and his expensive corporate espionage. He had recently taken out a massive, multi-million-dollar bridge loan from a deeply dangerous, unregulated private equity firm. He had secretly used my proprietary glass patents as the sole collateral. With the foreign acquisition completely dead in the water, Vance was instantly left holding an astronomical debt he could never possibly repay. I knew with absolute certainty that he would come for me. The oppressive tension inside my recovery room thickened until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my ruined shoulders. It was shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning when the heavy wooden hospital door was violently kicked open. The heavy door slammed so forcefully against the wall that the dry plaster visibly cracked. Vance stood in the dim doorway, panting heavily like a cornered, rabid animal. His expensive tailored suit was hopelessly wrinkled. His silk tie was ripped open, and his eyes were completely bloodshot from pure, unhinged fury and the desperate cross-country flight he had just endured. The pathetic, indifferent husband I had known for years was completely gone. In his place stood a violent, desperate man whose entire stolen empire had just collapsed around him. He lunged across the sterile room, completely ignoring the complex medical monitors keeping me stable. He grabbed the cold metal bed rails with white knuckles and leaned in so dangerously close I could clearly smell the stale airplane alcohol radiating from his breath. He aggressively demanded that I call my attack dog lawyer right that second and drop the federal injunction. He screamed absolute profanities, his spit hitting my face, threatening to physically drag me out of the bed and tear out my intravenous lines if I did not immediately comply. He raised his fist, his face contorted into a terrifying mask of pure violence, attempting to physically terrorize me into submission. I did not flinch. I did not scream for help. I simply stared up at him with cold, dead eyes. The intense physical pain burning across my back was entirely eclipsed by the absolute freezing calm of my own hatred. I spoke very softly, but my voice cut through the dark room like a surgical blade. "The deal is dead. Vance," I whispered coldly. "I know exactly where you were. I know exactly what you did to the kiln, and I know exactly who was waiting for you in that luxury hotel suite." The violent color completely drained from his face when I calmly spoke her name. "Camille Vaughn," I stated, watching his eyes widen in pure horror. I told him I knew absolutely everything about his 36-year-old mistress. I knew she was not just a random romantic affair. Camille was the secret inside corporate broker for the foreign conglomerate. She was the venomous snake who arranged the entire illicit acquisition behind the scenes, the one whispering in his ear to eliminate me so they could both run away incredibly wealthy. His jaw dropped open as he realized the terrifying depth of my knowledge. He realized he had walked straight into a perfectly laid trap. But a truly desperate man is a highly venomous creature. The initial shock quickly morphed into a cruel, deeply malicious sneer. If he was going down, he was fiercely determined to drag me into the dark abyss right alongside him. He leaned back, a sick, victorious smile spreading across his pale face. "You think you won?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. The moment those executives walked out of that restaurant, I made one phone call. I completely drained every single joint checking and savings account we possess, every single dime of our cash reserves. Your personal emergency funds, the factory payroll accounts, all of it is gone, transferred out to untraceable offshore routing numbers. He looked down at my heavily bandaged body and mockingly asked how exactly I plan to pay for the 3 massive, incredibly expensive skin graft surgeries scheduled for the next 14 days. He viciously declared that the hospital would soon throw me out onto the cold street, leaving me as a permanently deformed, penniless beggar with a worthless, bankrupt factory. His triumphant, evil laughter was abruptly cut short. From the dark hospital corridor, the distinct, heavy footsteps of several men echoed into the room. Elias Thorne stepped smoothly into the dim light, his tailored wool coat immaculate. He was flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed hospital security officers. Elias did not say a single word. He simply raised his hand and nodded slightly. The security team immediately swarmed the hospital bed. They grabbed Vance by his expensive collar and forcefully twisted his arms painfully behind his back. Vance began to thrash violently, screaming absolute profanities and kicking wildly. They dragged him backward toward the door, his expensive leather shoes scraping frantically against the linoleum floor. I lay perfectly still against my pillows, my face an entirely unreadable mask of solid stone. I watched his pathetic, flailing body disappear into the corridor, listening to his desperate, angry screams slowly fade away down the hall, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet, victorious silence of the night. The triumphant silence in my room shattered before sunrise. Elias Thorne did not leave after hospital security dragged my husband away. He pulled up a hard plastic chair, his face drained of victory. He opened a thick leather binder, pulling out the deeply buried financial disclosures he had spent the last 6 hours untangling. The multi-million-dollar bridge loan my husband had secured was not from a legitimate banking institution. Elias had tracked the routing numbers to a notorious underground syndicate, a violent black market credit ring heavily disguised as a boutique private equity fund. Elias looked me straight in the eye and delivered the terrifying reality. A federal court injunction meant absolutely nothing to men who operated with crowbars and loaded firearms. They did not respect the law. They only respected cold, hard cash. Before I could process this massive threat, my encrypted phone lit up. It was Clara. Her voice was trembling with raw, unadulterated terror. She told me that 4 massive black utility vehicles had just breached the main security gates of Apex Glassworks. Over a dozen tattooed men in dark jackets swarmed the production floor, physically cornering the night shift workers against the loading docks. Their leader had loudly declared that if they did not receive the massive sum of money by noon on Friday, they were going to systematically smash every single piece of manufacturing machinery into scrap metal and violently throw my entire loyal workforce out onto the cold street. A blinding fury erupted in my chest, instantly overriding the heavy pharmaceutical drugs pumping through my veins. My husband had not just tried to kill me, he had tied a concrete block to my life's work, expecting my workers to drown with me. I ripped the intravenous needle right out of my forearm. The heart rate monitor immediately began to shriek, drawing 2 frantic nurses and the lead attending physician into the room. They loudly ordered me back into bed, explicitly warning me that leaving the sterile ward with fresh, unhealed severe burns was a definitive death sentence. I completely ignored their frantic medical warnings, fighting back tears of blinding agony. I carefully forced my ruined, heavily bandaged body into a loose cotton hospital gown and sweatpants Clara had dropped off days ago. Every single agonizing movement felt like thousands of tiny razor-sharp needles driving directly into my spine. I demanded the discharge papers. When the doctor refused, I grabbed the pen with my trembling good hand and aggressively signed the legal waiver acknowledging I was leaving against medical advice. No criminal syndicate was going to terrorize my people while I hid in a hospital bed. Elias drove me directly to the industrial district. When we pulled up to the main warehouse doors of Apex Glassworks, the sheer tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. My loyal floor workers, clutching heavy steel wrenches and thick metal pipes, were standing in a tight, defensive formation behind Clara, completely refusing to abandon the factory. Facing them was a line of dangerous, silent enforcers. I pushed open the car door and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The sudden chill sent agonizing shockwaves across my burned skin, but I forced myself to stand completely straight, projecting an aura of absolute, unbreakable steel. The sea of enforcers slowly parted, and the syndicate boss stepped forward. He was a terrifyingly calm man, wearing an immaculately tailored dark suit that completely contrasted with the brutal industrial setting. He looked at my heavily bandaged shoulder, then looked directly into my eyes, offering a chilling, totally emotionless smile. He approached me slowly and laid out his ruthless ultimatum. He acknowledged that my husband was a pathetic, lying coward who had stolen the collateral, but the massive debt belonged to the factory. He pulled out a thick stack of legal transfer documents from his coat pocket and offered me a blood contract. Sign the entire deed of the glass factory over to my syndicate right now, he stated calmly, tapping the documents against his hand. Do this, and I will call off my men. I will leave you and your workers completely unharmed, and I will unleash my enforcers to hunt down your husband and extract the ultimate vengeance on your behalf. For a fleeting second, the dark, exhausted part of my soul wanted to surrender. I could just sign the paper, walk away from the massive debt, and let the criminal underworld devour the man who had tried to burn me alive. But as I looked past the impeccably dressed boss, I saw the terrified, deeply loyal faces of Clara and my workers. This factory was their livelihood, their family's survival. I suddenly realized exactly what my husband was doing. He was currently cowering in some luxurious, 5-star hotel suite with his mistress, cowardly using my shattered body and my dedicated employees as a fleshy human shield to absorb the violent consequences of his own massive greed. If I gave up the factory, he essentially won. I will not surrender a single inch of my property to you, I replied, staring directly into his cold eyes. The boss sighed heavily, his expression darkening into a promise of imminent violence. You have exactly until noon on Friday to find the money, he warned coldly. After that, your factory burns to the ground. As his black vehicles rolled out of the parking lot, my mind began to race at a terrifying speed. I could not simply fight a heavily armed criminal syndicate, and I absolutely refused to lose my factory. The only viable path to survival required a maneuver of absolute, suicidal insanity. I needed to construct a trap so massive it would completely swallow both threats at the exact same time. I turned to Elias and Clara, my voice dropping to a dangerous, calculated whisper. I told them I was going to use my cowardly husband as the ultimate, irresistible bait. I was going to drag him out of his luxurious hiding spot and orchestrate a catastrophic, head-on collision between the violent black credit ring and the full, crushing weight of the federal government. I was going exactly to the darkest edge of the abyss, and I was going to pull all of my enemies down with me. The clock was ticking relentlessly toward the Friday deadline, but I was no longer the helpless victim waiting for the executioner. With Elias Thorne utilizing his deep federal connections and my absolute mastery of digital routing, we constructed the perfect snare. I accessed the hidden web and deployed highly sophisticated spoofing software, completely hijacking the cellular identity of his mistress. I drafted a frantic, desperate text message and sent it directly to my husband. The message was simple but completely irresistible to a greedy, cornered rat. I wrote that the foreign buyers had left a massive secret slush fund of exactly $500,000 in untraceable cash secured inside the old floor safe at the Glassworks facility. The fake message instructed him to sneak into the factory precisely at midnight, grab the heavy bag of money, and meet her at the private airfield to flee the country forever. Exactly at 12 o'clock at night, the heavy iron side door of Apex Glassworks let out a long, agonizing squeak. I was sitting perfectly still in my wheelchair in the absolute pitch black of the central production floor. Through the heavy gloom, I watched the shadowy figure of my husband creeping frantically through the aisles of heavy machinery. He was panting heavily, clutching a heavy metal crowbar, his eyes darting around like a hunted animal. He dropped to his knees in front of the rusted floor safe and violently swung the steel bar. Before the metal could even strike, I reached over and slammed my hand onto the master breaker switch. The massive, high-voltage industrial overhead lights slammed on with a deafening electrical crack. The entire factory floor was instantly bathed in blinding, surgical white light. Vance screamed and dropped his weapon, throwing his hands over his face. When his eyes finally adjusted, the pathetic look of absolute horror that washed over his pale face was the most intensely satisfying image I had ever witnessed. I was not alone. Standing in a massive, impenetrable semicircle directly behind me were over 20 heavily armed federal agents, their tactical rifles raised and locked squarely on his chest. Beside me stood Elias Thorne, holding a thick briefcase containing every single piece of undeniable evidence regarding the corporate espionage. Vance raised his hands, his knees trembling so violently he could barely stand. But before the lead federal agent could even read him his rights, the deafening sound of shattering safety glass echoed from the main loading docks. Clara had executed the second, crucial phase of my plan flawlessly. Just 15 minutes prior, she had placed an untraceable, anonymous phone call directly to the burner phone of the syndicate boss, urgently tipping him off that the massive debtor was currently inside the factory, desperately trying to abscond with a hidden fortune. The heavy metal bay doors were violently torn completely off their hinges as 3 massive black trucks rammed straight into the building. The syndicate enforcers poured out, brandishing heavy shotguns and steel pipes, fully expecting to ambush a cowardly man stealing their money. Instead, they ran headfirst into a massive, heavily fortified wall of federal tactical units. Total, absolute chaos erupted. The federal agents immediately shifted their formation, taking aim at the new threat. "Drop the weapons right now and get on the ground," the lead tactical commander roared through the echoing facility. The syndicate boss froze, his cold, arrogant demeanor entirely shattered as he realized he had just driven his entire criminal empire straight into a massive federal trap, trapped precisely in the middle of the deadly standoff, caught directly between the raised barrels of federal rifles and the murderous, glaring eyes of the ruthless loan sharks he had defrauded. Vance completely broke. He collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, sobbing uncontrollably, curling into a pathetic, trembling ball. "I will tell you absolutely everything. Just do not let them kill me," he screamed hysterically, crying like a terrified child. In a desperate bid to save his own miserable life from the syndicate enforcers, he began screaming a full, unedited confession directly to the federal authorities. He frantically detailed every single wire fraud transaction, every hidden offshore bank account, and explicitly laid out the entire extortion and money laundering network operated by the fake private equity fund. It was a total, sweeping massacre of my enemies. The federal authorities systematically disarmed and arrested every single syndicate member, completely decapitating the violent black market credit ring in one single, devastating swoop. They dragged my weeping, broken husband off the concrete floor, tightly handcuffing his wrists. As he was marched past my wheelchair in utter disgrace, he did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. The justice system showed absolutely no mercy. Armed with his own hysterical, recorded confession and the mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously gathered, the judge handed Vance a crushing sentence of 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive financial fraud, severe economic espionage, and criminal conspiracy. When the foreign conglomerate realized the federal government was involved, they entirely severed all ties with his mistress, leaving her completely bankrupt and facing her own severe legal battles. She abandoned Vance immediately, never even visiting him during the trial. He lost his wealth, his stolen company, his freedom, and every single shred of his pathetic pride. Exactly 6 months later, the cold, crisp winter air surrounded the factory. I stood tall and completely unassisted on my own 2 feet in the center of the production floor. The heavy white bandages were gone, replaced by the deep, raw, and beautiful scars that mapped the entire right side of my body. I wore those scars like highly polished armor. The factory was alive again, filled with the loud, triumphant hum of heavy machinery and the busy, dedicated movements of my loyal workers. I reached out with a steady and unyielding hand and firmly pressed the heavy ignition button. With a magnificent, roaring boom, the massive industrial kiln flared back to life, blasting a wave of glorious, intense heat across the floor. I stood firmly in the warm, golden glow of the raging fire, breathing in the scent of melting sand and pure, absolute victory. My empire is made of glass, but it will never be shattered again. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners for joining me on this incredible journey of justice and survival. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and satisfying, please consider supporting our team with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your generous contribution ensures we can pay our hardworking staff to feed their families and continue bringing you more amazing revenge stories. Thank you again, and stay strong.